Welcome to This Day in His Story, created by American Heritage Worldwide, a reminder that every day holds something new to learn. Did you know that on May 24, 1883, the newly built Brooklyn Bridge connected the New York cities of Brooklyn and Manhattan across the East River? Discover that Emily Roebling, the wife of the deceased bridge builder, took the first ride over the bridge with a rooster on her lap as a symbol of victory. Learn that 150,000 people walked across the Brooklyn Bridge in the first 24 hours of its opening, and that a year later, on May 17, 1884, circus owner P.T. Barnum marched 21 elephants and 17 camels across the Brooklyn Bridge.
Before a single stone was even laid for the Brooklyn Bridge, the mastermind who designed it was killed, basically by a stray boat.
Yeah, just completely crushed his foot against a dock.
Right. It was this mundane, almost absurd accident. And it left the greatest, the most perilous engineering project of the 19th century completely in the hands of his 32-year-old son.
Which is just wild to think about.
It really is. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are going through a massive stack of sources for you today. We've got historical excerpts, engineering blueprints, archival newspaper articles.
And even a text that uses the structure as a sort of spiritual metaphor.
Exactly. Our mission for you today is to explore the sheer human drama behind the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. We're looking at the wildly surreal celebrations of its opening and the literal and metaphorical connections it creates for us today.
It's a monument that completely redefined the global skyline.
It did, but the story starts with a brilliant, doomed engineer named John Roebling. Okay, let's unpack this. Who was this guy?
Well, John Roebling was a German-born engineer, and he was a true pioneer in the realm of steel suspension bridges. At the time, we're talking the late 1860s, connecting Brooklyn and Manhattan was an absolute economic necessity.
Because the East River was, one of the busiest waterways on the planet.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The traffic was constant. You couldn't just build a traditional bridge with dozens of stone piers because it would block all the shipping lanes.
Sure, the boats wouldn't get through.
Exactly. And you couldn't build a drawbridge because there was just too much traffic. The only option was to go over it all, suspended high in the air. And Roebling had already proven he could do this. He was a master at it, actually, with successful projects at Niagara Falls and over the Ohio River in Cincinnati.
But the primary challenge with suspension bridges, at least from what I'm reading, isn't necessarily holding the weight of the roadway up. It's keeping the roadway from tearing itself apart in the wind.
Yes, the wind is the real enemy there.
And the sources point to Roebling's major breakthrough for the Brooklyn Bridge, which is this thing called a web truss design.
Right, the web truss. That is the key to the entire endeavor.
So he basically added this heavy metal lattice to the sides of the bridge to stabilize the whole structure.
Yeah, because the main cables running from the towers down to the deck, they hold the vertical weight. But the wind, the weather, and just the sheer movement of people and carts, they create lateral forces.
Like pushing it side to side.
Exactly. They cause torsion. If the wind hits a flat, suspended surface, it acts like a sail. It'll just twist the roadway until the cables snap. So the web truss was Roebling's countermeasure to stop that twisting.
The mechanics of that actually remind me of a canoe.
The canoe.
Yeah, think about it. If you are paddling a very narrow canoe on rough water, the boat naturally wants to roll over, right? The slightest shift in weight, or a rogue wave, and you capsize.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Right, but if you attach an outrigger, like a rigid structural brace that sits parallel to the boat, you distribute that lateral force. The boat becomes incredibly stable against the cross-chop. So Roebling's web truss is functioning like a massive, continuous outrigger woven directly into the sides of the bridge deck. It just locks it in place against the wind.
That's a great way to visualize it. It stiffens the entire deck, so those suspension cables only have to worry about the vertical loads. It completely neutralizes the horizontal wind forces.
Which is brilliant.
What's fascinating here is the sheer pressure placed on his son, because John Roebling never got to build it.
Right, the tragedy.
Yeah, in 1869, literally right before construction begins, John is standing on the edge of the river. He's taking compass readings to establish the exact alignment of the towers. And a ferry boat just comes into the slip and violently pins his foot against the wooden pilings.
And a crush injury like that in 1869, I mean, that was essentially a death sentence.
It really was.
The sources detail that he developed a severe tetanus infection. And he actually insisted on treating it himself with water therapy.
which obviously didn't work.
No, it failed completely. He
Right.
died in agony 3 weeks later, so the project hasn't even broken ground, and the chief engineer is dead.
Which forces his son, Washington Roebling, into an unimaginable position. At 32 years old, Washington inherits this monumental task.
Yeah.
He suddenly has to construct what will be the tallest structure in the Western Hemisphere at the time.
32. I mean, the psychological pressure alone would be crushing.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
He's tasked with executing this dream that just killed his father.
Mm-hmm.
And he knows that any structural failure on a bridge this large would mean the deaths of thousands of people.
Wow. And that leads directly into the construction itself, right? Which spans this grueling 14-year period. But here's a question for you. If they are building a bridge above the water, why did the workers face their greatest dangers deep underneath it?
Ah, that is the darkest part of this whole story. To build the tallest structure into the sky, they had to go terrifyingly deep underwater to anchor it.
Into the bedrock.
Right, solid bedrock. But doing that in the 1870s across a treacherous rushing tidal strait like the East River, they had to excavate millions of tons of mud under a crushing column of water.
How do they even do that without the river collapsing in on them?
They used this wild technology called pneumatic caissons.
Okay, what is that?
Imagine an enormous, airtight wooden box, basically the size of half a city block. They built it out of thick pine timber, covered it in pitch to make it watertight, towed it out into the river, and then flipped it upside down and let it sink to the muddy bottom.
Upside down, like a giant cup pushed into a bucket of water.
Exactly. And to keep the river water from rushing underneath and flooding the workspace, they pumped the interior full of highly compressed air. The pressure of the air inside the box literally pushed the water out. So it created a dry, breathable workspace at the absolute bottom of the river.
That's insane. But, wait. If you have a massive wooden box pumped full of compressed air holding back the ocean, how did the men actually get inside? If you open a door, wouldn't all that pressurized air just blow out?
Yes, and the water would violently rush in. That is where the airlock comes in. They built these iron shafts reaching from the surface down through the roof of the sunken caisson.
Oh.
Inside the shaft was a small iron room with two heavily reinforced doors. The workers, they called them sandhogs, would climb down, step into the iron room, and seal the top door. Then a valve opens, flooding that tiny room with compressed air until the pressure matched the extreme pressure of the caisson below.
And once it equalized, they could open the bottom door and climb down.
Exactly.
But what about the mud? I mean, they couldn't just haul tons of excavated riverbed up through a tiny airlock.
No, for the mud they used water shafts, open tubes that ran from the surface down into a pool of water at the bottom of the caisson. The extreme air pressure held the water level in the tube down. The workers shoveled mud into the pool, and then clamshell buckets would drop from cranes on the surface, plunge through the water shaft, scoop up the mud, and pull it away.
Wow. And as they dug, the massive granite towers being built on top would just slowly force the wooden box deeper into the earth.
Inch by agonizing inch until it hit bedrock.
But the environment down there sounds like a literal vision of hell. The sources describe it as incredibly hot, deafeningly loud from the pickaxes echoing, and lit entirely by gas lamps.
Which is terrifying when you think about it.
Right. A fire inside an enclosed underwater wooden box is bad enough, but a fire inside an environment pumped full of compressed oxygen, the wood would burn with explosive ferocity.
And they did have fires. On the Brooklyn side, a worker's candle got too close to the roof packing, and the fire caught. It was pushed deep into the timber by the air pressure. Washington Roebling himself spent hours inside the caisson fighting the fire.
He had to flood the entire structure with millions of gallons of water just to put it out, right?
Yeah, delaying the project for months. But the fires weren't even the deadliest part. It was the depth. The Brooklyn foundation had to be laid 44 feet below the water surface.
Which is deep.
It is.
Yeah.
But on the Manhattan side, the bedrock was way deeper. They had to dig down 78 feet. And at that extreme depth, the workers encountered a silent, invisible killer.
Right. Our sources dedicate a lot of space to this, the outbreak of the bends or compression sickness.
Yeah, when you're working 78 feet underwater, the air pressure required to keep the river out is immense. As the men breathed it, nitrogen gas dissolved directly into their bloodstream.
Which is fine while they're under pressure, right?
Mostly, yes. The danger happened during the exit.
I read it's the exact same mechanics as a shaken bottle of soda. While the cap is on, the liquid looks completely still, the gas is dissolved. But the moment you unscrew that cap and release the pressure too quickly, the gas violently expands and forms bubbles everywhere.
Now imagine those bubbles forming inside your blood vessels, your joints, your spinal cord. When the sandhogs came up to the airlocks, they were depressurizing way too fast.
Because they didn't know any better at the time.
Exactly. The dissolved nitrogen turned back into gas. These microscopic bubbles blocked blood flow, causing agonizing joint pain. The workers would literally be bent over in agony, which is why they called it the bends.
God, that's horrific. And the bubbles in the spinal cord caused paralysis or even instant death if they reached the brain.
The human toll was just devastating. Over 100 men suffered from compression sickness. Dozens were killed, not just from the bends, but falling granite blocks, snapped cables, fires.
Even Washington Roebling himself was severely crippled by the bends, right?
Yes. After spending too much time fighting that case on fire, he was left paralyzed. He had to oversee the rest of the bridge's construction through a telescope from his apartment window.
That's incredibly tragic.
The physical suffering is inextricably bound to the architecture. The expert consensus is that every time you look at the majestic stone towers of the Brooklyn Bridge, you're looking at the tomb of those laborers. The foundations of that iconic skyline were laid in complete darkness, bought with extreme human sacrifice.
Which really makes the ultimate completion of the bridge feel less like a construction milestone and more like the end of a brutal war.
It really was a 14-year war against nature.
Yeah. So finally, on May 24th, 1883, the bridge officially opens to the public. And the celebration is this surreal explosion of relief and triumph. You have the President of the United States, Chester A. Arthur, and the Governor of New York, Grover Cleveland, leading this massive procession of military bands.
The political significance was enormous. The bridge was the physical manifestation of American industrial might. The whole world was watching this structure formally unite two massive economies.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Amidst all this heavy political pomp and circumstance, the very first person granted a ride over the completed bridge was Emily Roebling. Now, our sources explicitly identify her as the widow of the principal engineer, John A. Roebling. And as she takes this incredibly historic, triumphant carriage ride across the suspension span, she does it with a live rooster sitting squarely on her lap.
Which is such a bizarre but perfect detail. It encapsulates the mood of the day. A rooster is the universal symbol of the dawn of awakening of a new era.
A victory lap.
Exactly. Carrying it across the bridge was an undeniable declaration of victory over the darkness of the caissons and all the tragedies that had plagued the project.
And the public response was an absolute frenzy. The sources estimate that more than 150,000 people crossed the Brooklyn Bridge in just the first 24 hours.
That's a staggering number of people for 1883.
Right, and they used the broad pedestrian promenade, which was this elevated walkway built entirely above the lanes for carts and horses. John Roebling designed this specifically for the public to enjoy, which is honestly a stunning piece of forward-thinking urban planning.
It really democratized the sky. The promenade wasn't about commerce. It was designed so the average citizen could walk up above the grit of the city streets and experience the grandeur of the view.
The New York Times actually covered the opening the very next day. They reported that the pleasant weather brought swarms of visitors from all over. Over 50,000 people arrived by the railroads alone, plus thousands more pouring in from ferry boats.
It was a massive event.
It was, but there's a very telling observation buried in that Times piece. The reporter wrote that the opening of the bridge was decidedly Brooklyn's celebration. They said New York's participation was meager, mostly just crowded streets.
You really have to view that through the lens of the 1880s. At that time, Brooklyn and New York were entirely separate, independent cities.
Right, they weren't unified yet.
No, they were rivals in a way. Brooklyn was the third largest city in America, but it was often overshadowed by the sheer economic gravity of Manhattan. So for Brooklyn, this bridge wasn't just a road. It was their permanent physical link to the mainland. It was a monument to their own engineering prowess. They claimed the triumph because they saw it as their arrival on the world stage.
That makes total sense. So the dignitaries have crossed, the rooster has crossed, 150,000 people have crossed. But the spectacle surrounding the bridge's safety wasn't actually over, was it?
Not at all.
Because almost exactly a year later, on May 17, 1884, the great showman P.T. Barnum approaches the bridge authorities. And he marches an entire circus menagerie, specifically 21 elephants and 17 camels, straight across the main span.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, It sounds like a pure publicity stunt. And for Barnum, it absolutely was.
Of course.
But for the bridge engineers, it actually served a vital, practical purpose. Despite the massive opening day crowds, a deep psychological fear lingered in the public consciousness. A steel wire suspension bridge of this magnitude had never existed.
People were terrified it would just snap, right?
Exactly. They thought the wind or heavy traffic would cause it to collapse into the river. So marching 21 elephants across the bridge provided a dynamic, moving load of staggering weight.
Oh, wow. I never thought of it like that.
Yeah, when the public saw dozens of multi-ton elephants stomping across the span without the bridge even trembling, it was the ultimate, undeniable proof of the web truss's strength. The elephants basically cured the public's fear.
That is incredible. And from carrying circus elephants in 1884 to shaping modern transit, the bridge has constantly evolved to meet the needs of the people.
It really has. Today, it carries 6 lanes of automotive traffic, plus light rail transit.
But it's also served as a profound lifeline during some of the darkest moments in modern history. Our sources highlight September 11th, 2001. When the terrorist attacks devastated Lower Manhattan, the entire subway and transit system was completely shut down. The Brooklyn Bridge suddenly became this vital escape route, allowing thousands of pedestrians to flee the dust and destruction on foot.
In that moment, the bridge stripped away all its modern context and reverted to its most fundamental purpose. It provided a sturdy, unyielding path over the waters when every other option had collapsed. It stood exactly as John and Washington Roebling designed it to stand.
Yeah. And that enduring physical strength has also allowed the bridge to permeate our culture as a really powerful metaphor. Which brings us to another source in our stack today. It takes a completely different approach to the structure.
Right, it pivots away from the engineering facts.
Yeah. Exactly. It uses the mechanics of the Brooklyn Bridge to illustrate a lesson on spiritual resilience. The author argues that, when you're traveling, you can look for bridges and identify their specific designs. But we are all tasked with building invisible bridges of our own bridges, of friendship with faith and trust.
That's a beautiful concept.
So what does this all mean? According to the text, these daily actions of bridge building are what tangibly connect us to one another and ultimately bring us closer to Heavenly Father. Can you think of different ways to build bridges of friendship, or how you can help others build bridges of faith and trust?
It actually maps perfectly onto the engineering principles we've discussed today. A physical bridge requires deep, unseen foundations anchored in solid bedrock.
Like the caissons.
Exactly. It requires a web truss design that can absorb tremendous lateral pressure without tearing the structure apart. The source suggests the exact same is true for the human spirit. Building a bridge of faith or a lasting relationship requires daily actions that stabilize the bond against the unpredictable storms of life.
Right. It requires patience, deep emotional anchors,
And absolute trust in the structural integrity of the connection you are building.
We've covered an incredible amount of ground today. We started with a fatal compass reading on the edge of the river, we explored the brilliant physics of the steel web truss, and we descended 78 feet into the suffocating, fiery depths of the caissons.
And then follow those granite blocks up into the sky.
Yeah, up to celebrate with a victorious rooster, 150,000 pedestrians, and a parade of circus elephants. And we've looked at how those massive steel cables have become an enduring symbol for the eternal bridges of faith and trust we build in our own lives.
And all of it really hinges on the concept of foresight. The men who dug the mud in the caissons and the engineers who calculated the tension of the cables, they were pouring their lives into a structure they knew would outlast them by centuries.
Which is profound.
This raises an important question. When you look at any massive achievement or connection in your own life, whether it's a physical structure or a deeply held relationship, how much of its strength relies entirely on unseen foundations that were built through profound sacrifice and unwavering trust?
That leaves you with something entirely new to think about the next time you find yourself looking at an iconic monument or, even just crossing a bridge in your own town. The Sandhogs and the Roeblings sacrificed their health, and in many cases their lives, to build a path for generations they would never even live to see. They built for a future they would never inhabit. So as you go through your day, ask yourself, what are you building right now? Whether it's a project at work, a piece of art, or a deep foundational relationship in your family that will carry people you will never meet.
Thank you for joining us for this day in His story. May the lessons of yesterday inspire you to see God's hand today and to play your part in His story now. For more faith-based learning, visit ahsworldwide.org, the homeschool for faith and family.